They called me a greedy old hag, until I reminded them who owns the house. Now they know what a greedy old hag can do. Melissa dropped my wedding album into the trash, the spine bending under the careless weight of her hands. The leather cover landed with a dull thud, followed by the sharper clink of picture frames. My family's smiles, now lying face down against metal. She brushed her palms together, as if she had just gotten rid of something dirty. "You should forget about this junk, Ariel," she said, her voice slow, deliberate, and dripping with the smugness of someone who believes they have already won. "This house belongs to us now." From the doorway, Martin, my only son, leaned casually against the frame, a coffee mug in his hand, wearing that half-smirk he had started wearing more and more often. "Mom, why are you still keeping that big master bedroom all to yourself? You don't have guests. We could turn it into a game room. At least it would be more useful than a space full of your old stuff." I stood there, my hands tightening at my sides, the sting of their words burning deeper than I wanted to admit. This was the home my husband and I had built with our own hands over 40 years ago. Every beam, every shingle, every nail was placed through our sweat and labor. Back then, we worked long hours, lived frugally, and saved every penny until we could buy this plot of land. We spent weekends digging, hammering, painting, laying the floors together, arguing over paint colors, and laughing when we made mistakes. It took years, but eventually we paid off every cent of the mortgage. When the bank sent the final statement marked "paid in full," we framed it and hung it in the hallway. This house was more than wood and walls. It was our story. It was where we celebrated birthdays, where our son took his first steps, where my husband's laughter echoed down the halls late at night. After my husband passed, the house became quieter. The space felt bigger, emptier, but it was still mine, and I cared for it like I always had. I kept the garden blooming the way he liked, polished the railings he carved, and sat on the porch each evening with tea, watching the neighborhood shift and change while my home remained steady. Then came the phone call from Martin. He said he and Melissa wanted to move in to help me out, to be there for me in my old age. At the time, it sounded reasonable, sweet, even. I imagined having company for dinner, laughter in the kitchen again, maybe even the warmth of family filling the empty rooms. But it did not take long for me to realize the truth. Melissa arrived with her eyes already scanning the place like a buyer inspecting a property. She moved my things without asking, replaced the curtains with something she called modern but looked like it belonged in a cheap motel, and complained about the clutter. That, to me, was a lifetime of memories. Martin said little, but his silence spoke louder than words. He let her rearrange, criticize, and claim space that was not hers. And now here they stood, Melissa throwing my history into the trash, Martin suggesting my bedroom be gutted for their entertainment. Melissa crossed her arms, her stance wide like she was already the queen of this castle. "It's selfish to hold on to space you don't use," she said sharply. "We're here now, living here every day, paying for groceries, keeping the place running. It makes sense we use the rooms the way we want." I let out a slow breath. "Melissa, you use my credit card for groceries, and this house has been running just fine for decades without your help." Her eyes narrowed, but Martin quickly stepped in. "Mom, we're not trying to fight. We just think you're stuck in the past. The house needs new energy, and frankly, you're not using it right. We're cramped in the guest room while you've got all that space to yourself." Cramped? The guest room they occupied was larger than most master bedrooms in this city. This was not about space. It was about control. Melissa tilted her head, letting a pause stretch before delivering the final blow. "You've said before you'd leave the house to Martine when you're gone. Why wait? Why not just make it official now? You're holding on out of spite, fear, or maybe you're just greedy." Greedy. The word landed like a slap. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, but he only met my gaze with an unsettling stillness, as if he agreed. I thought of the times I had bailed him out, when he'd dropped out of college, when his business failed, when his debts threatened to swallow him whole. I had sold a piece of my land to help him once, and now he stood here, letting his wife call me greedy for keeping what little I had left. I could have shouted. I could have told them to pack their things and leave that very minute. But I didn't. Instead, I turned, walked past them, and retrieved my wedding album from the trash. I set it gently back on the shelf. exactly where it had always been. Melissa's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "This house is mine," I said finally, my voice calm and even. "It will remain mine until the day I decide otherwise." Melissa laughed, a short, sharp sound. "We'll see about that." Martin followed her out of the room, their footsteps fading down the hall. I sat back at the kitchen table, picked up my tea and took a slow sip. They thought I was beaten. They thought my silence meant surrender. Let them think that. If they wanted to see what a greedy old hag could do, I would show them. And they would never forget it. 10 years ago, long before Martin and Melissa were standing in my living room, acting like they owned it, the story between us had already begun to crack. It was during a time when Martin was drowning, his business venture had collapsed, and with it came a mountain of debt that could have easily buried him for years. I remember the night he came over. It was late, nearly 10 o'clock, and I had been in the kitchen washing dishes. He knocked once, softly, before stepping inside, his eyes darting away from mine like a boy caught doing something wrong. I dried my hands and asked him to sit, already sensing the weight he was carrying. He told me everything in a voice just above a whisper. The investors had pulled out, his suppliers were demanding payment, and the bank had begun sending notices that felt more like threats. It was bad, worse than he had admitted to anyone else. He had nowhere else to turn. I should have asked questions, pressed him about the risks he had taken, the mistakes he had made, but I didn't. I saw my son, the same boy who once brought me dandelions from the yard and thought they were roses, sitting in front of me with his shoulders bent under the kind of shame I recognized. I had been in his place once, when I was young and foolish. I knew the desperation in his eyes. I told him I had something. Not much, but something. The land my parents had left me, a stretch of green in the small town where I grew up, was divided into 2 parcels. One I had always planned to keep. The other I had been holding on to without a clear reason, except that it was mine. 2 weeks later, I sold that parcel. The money wiped away his debt, covered the penalties, and even gave him a little breathing room to start over. He hugged me that day like a drowning man grabbing the edge of a boat. He promised he would pay me back, promised he would never forget what I had done. But time has a way of making people forget their promises, especially when they start to believe they were owed what they received. Years passed, and Martin's life smoothed out. He married Melissa, a woman who, from the beginning, seemed to measure everything and everyone by what she could gain from them. She was charming enough to most people, but I could see the way her eyes wandered over my home during their first visit, the way she asked casual questions about what I planned to do with it in the future. When she became pregnant, they came over one Sunday afternoon, Melissa glowing and Martin with that cautious smile he wore when he wanted something. We had just finished lunch when he cleared his throat. "Mom, we've been thinking," he began, looking down at his plate as if the food there was suddenly fascinating. "It would really help us if we could get into a bigger place before the baby comes." Melissa placed her hand over her stomach in that theatrical way that people do when they want to remind you of a shared obligation. "The apartment is just too small for a nursery," she said. "We've been looking at houses, but with the market right now, the down payments are insane." I listened, already knowing where this was going. Martin glanced at me, then continued, "We remembered you still have that piece of land back in Oak Ridge. If you sold it, you could easily help us buy a place. It would be a real blessing, Mom." I put my fork down and folded my hands on the table. "That land is where my parents are buried," I said. "It's not just dirt to me, Martin. It's home. It's history." Melissa gave a soft laugh that was anything but amused. "History is nice, but you can't live in history. This is about the future, our future, and your grandchild's future." I felt something twist in my chest, the same place where guilt likes to settle, but I also felt the sting of remembering the first parcel I sold for Martin. I remembered the relief in his eyes that day, and how quickly that relief had turned into expectation. I would not make the same mistake again. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady. "The land is not for sale." Melissa's smile vanished like a light switched off. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp. "So you'd rather keep a field with a couple of headstones than help your own family?" Martin looked at her, then at me, and I could see his decision in the way his jaw tightened. "I can't believe you," he said. "After everything you've done for me." I repeated, my voice quieter now but far heavier. "Martin, I sold land to keep you from losing everything. I have opened my home to you whenever you've needed it. He cut me off with a shake of his head. "Forget it. We'll figure it out ourselves." But his tone carried no gratitude, no humility, only resentment. From that day forward, something in the way they looked at me changed. I could feel it in the clipped phone calls, the lack of visits, unless they needed something. Melissa began making sly comments at family gatherings. "Ariel's got her land and her house all to herself," she'd say with a little shrug, as if to imply I was hoarding treasures from the people who deserved them. Before long, the whispers became more direct. I heard from my niece that Melissa had told her I was selfish and holding on to things just to feel important. Martin never corrected her. If anything, he seemed to enjoy the narrative. They were the struggling young couple, and I was the rich, stubborn old woman sitting on assets I refused to share. It didn't matter to them that the land was sacred to me, that I had already sacrificed a part of my inheritance to save Martin once. In their eyes, my refusal this time erased every kindness I had ever given. They began to treat me not as a mother or mother-in-law, but as an obstacle. And obstacles, in their world, were things to be removed. Looking back now, I can see that this was the turning point. This was when the idea of my house, my land, my life's work being theirs stopped being a dream and started becoming a plan. They stopped asking and started scheming. I did not know exactly when they would make their move. I only knew that they would. And when they did, I would remember every slight, every whisper, every time they called me a selfish old woman to anyone who would listen. Because the truth is, they taught me something in those years. They taught me that generosity, when given to the wrong people, becomes an invitation for greed. And greed, as they were about to learn, is a dangerous thing to provoke in someone like me. The day they finally pushed me to the edge started out quiet. The kind of Miami morning where the air is warm but still, and the hum of cicadas feels like it has been there forever. I left the house after breakfast to pick up a few groceries. Just bread, milk, and the tea I like that the corner store keeps behind the counter because hardly anyone else drinks it anymore. I was gone no more than an hour. When I came back, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like the house itself was holding its breath. I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, my bag of groceries in hand, and stopped. The door to my room was different. A new lock, shiny and silver, glared back at me from the wood where the old brass knob had been. I reached for it, turned it, and found it locked tight. My key, the one I had kept on the same ring for decades, no longer fit. Before I could knock, I heard voices from down the hall. Melissa's voice, clipped and brisk. I followed it to the garage, and when I pushed the door open, the air inside smelled faintly of dust and the faint sweetness of cedar from my old hope chest. And there, scattered across the concrete floor, was my life. My dresser, pushed against the wall beside the lawnmower. My nightstand, its drawers hanging open. My clothes, still on hangers, stacked in uneven piles. Even the quilt my mother had sewn for me when I got married was draped carelessly over a stack of cardboard boxes. It was as if my entire existence had been uprooted and dumped in storage. Melissa was standing in the middle of it all, her phone in one hand, her other hand on her hip. She didn't look up when she said, "Guests sleep in the garage. Guests who don't pay rent should leave altogether." I set the groceries down slowly, the plastic bag handles biting into my fingers. "Melissa," I said, keeping my voice even, "this is my house. That was my room." She looked up then, meeting my gaze without a flicker of hesitation. "Not anymore. You said we could live here, so we're making some changes." "You don't use that big room," Melissa said with a shrug. "Let me repeat one more time. Like I said before, you don't even use that big room. We could turn it into something useful, maybe a home office or a studio. Anything's better than it sitting full of your old junk." Before I could answer, Martin walked in from the side door, a folded piece of paper in his hand. He didn't meet my eyes right away. "Mom," he began, his tone almost rehearsed. "We've been talking. This arrangement, it's not working. You're holding on to things that would be better for all of us if you let go." He held out the paper. "This is a transfer of ownership form. Just sign it and everything will be easier. You'll still get to live here, but the house will officially be ours. That way we can take care of it properly." I didn't take the paper. "No." His jaw tightened. "If you don't sign, then next week you'll be in a nursing home. At least there, someone will be willing to listen to you talk." The words hit me like cold water. Not because I feared a nursing home, I feared nothing from them anymore, but because of how easily my son, my own flesh and blood, could speak to me that way. "Martin," I said slowly, "your father and I built this house. We paid for it, brick by brick, and you're standing here asking me to give it away like it's nothing." He stepped closer, the paper still held out, his voice harder now. "I'm not asking, Mom. I'm telling you, if you want to make this easy, sign it. Otherwise," Melissa cut in, her voice bright and false, "otherwise we'll have to do things the hard way, and you don't want that, do you?" I looked at both of them, the woman who had married my son and immediately set her sights on my home, and the son who had once cried in my arms when his business failed, who I had rescued with the land my parents left me, and now here they were, treating me like a trespasser in my own life. I let the silence stretch, long enough for Melissa to shift her weight and for Martin to glance at her like he was wondering why I wasn't breaking yet. I bent down, picked up my grocery bag, and straightened without touching the paper he still held. "Enjoy the room," I said finally, my tone flat. "You've taken it, after all. But this house, will never be yours." Melissa laughed lightly, like she was humoring a child. "We'll see." Martin lowered the paper, but didn't put it away. His eyes lingered on me, and I could see it in his face. He believed he had all the time in the world to make me bend. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that this was the moment I stopped being passive. This was the moment I decided that whatever patience I had for them was gone. I turned, walked back into the kitchen, and placed my groceries neatly on the counter. My hands were steady, my breathing calm, but inside me something had shifted into place. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought a locked door, a pile of my belongings in the garage, and a piece of paper could make me surrender. They were wrong. And soon they were going to learn just how wrong they were. I did not give them the satisfaction of a fight. I knew that was what they wanted, to see me shouting, to catch me angry, so they could twist the story later into something they could use. Instead, I nodded once, turned away, and went about my evening as if nothing had happened. But inside, the decision had already been made. That night, after the house went quiet, I sat at the small desk in my room, no longer the master bedroom, but the cramped spare space they had decided was good enough for me. I pulled out my old address book, the one I had kept for decades, its pages worn soft from use. My fingers found the name without hesitation: Frank Miller. Frank had been my late husband's closest friend in the service. The two of them had shared a foxhole in a war neither of them liked to talk about in detail. All I knew was that my husband had once pulled Frank out of the line of fire, saving his life. They had stayed close after they both came home, and though the years and distance had pulled them apart, the bond never broke. I had sent Frank a Christmas card every year since my husband passed. He always called me Ari, just like my husband used to. I picked up the phone and dialed the number written in his neat block handwriting. It rang twice before a warm, steady voice answered. "Ari? Well, I'll be damned. How are you, sweetheart?" I swallowed, keeping my voice even. "Frank, I'm fine, but I need to talk to you about something serious, and I think you're the only one I can trust with it." There was no hesitation. "You tell me when and where." The next afternoon I met him at a small cafe just outside town. He looked older, silver hair cropped short, a few more lines around his eyes, but there was still something unshakable about him. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct. Over coffee, I told him everything. I didn't dramatize, didn't cry. I laid out the facts. How Martin and Melissa had moved in under the guise of helping me. How they had slowly tried to take control. How they had locked me out of my own bedroom and shoved my belongings into the garage. And how Martin had handed me a fake transfer of ownership form, threatening a nursing home if I didn't sign. By the time I finished, Frank's jaw was tight, his eyes like steel. "Ari," he said slowly, "you know I've done well for myself these past years. I've got property all over the state. But this is different. This is family. And if you're telling me you're ready to hit back, I'll make sure it's done right." I nodded. I don't just want them out of my house, Frank. I want to make sure they can never use my name, my property, or my generosity against me again. I want them to know this is not a game they can win." He smiled, a slow, dangerous smile I remembered from years ago, when he and my husband played cards and Frank was holding a hand nobody else saw coming. "Then here's what we'll do." Within a week, the paperwork was ready. It was not a transfer of ownership to Martin as he had wanted. It was a legitimate sale to Frank, drawn up by one of the best real estate attorneys in Miami. On paper, the house would no longer be mine, at least not in the way my son imagined. But the contract included very specific clauses. First, I would have the right to live in the house for the rest of my life, rent-free, with full control over my own quarters. Second, the new owner, Frank, would have the immediate legal right to remove any person who harassed me, threatened me, or disrupted my life in the home. And third, Frank would retain the right to pursue civil and criminal charges against anyone who defamed me, attempted to illegally claim the property, or caused any damage to it. The language was airtight, crafted so that not even the most creative lawyer could twist it. When I read the final draft, I looked up at Frank. "Are you sure you want to do this? This could get ugly." He shrugged. "Your husband saved my life, Ari. This is nothing compared to that. Besides," he added with a hint of mischief, "I've been looking for an excuse to use my new security team." I signed the papers without hesitation. As soon as the ink was dry, Frank leaned back in his chair. "So, when do you want to tell them?" I shook my head. "Not yet. I want them to think they've won a little longer. It'll make the fall that much harder." Frank chuckled. "You always were the quiet one, dangerous in your own way." Over the next few days I played my part. I stayed polite, even subdued around Martin and Melissa. I let Melissa keep the master bedroom. I ignored Martin's smug glances when he passed me in the hallway. They thought they had me under control, that they had backed me into submission. What they didn't know was that every time they spoke to me like I was a burden, every time Melissa rearranged something or Martin made a remark about "when the house is ours," the noose around their plan was tightening. Frank and I set a date, one they wouldn't see coming. It was timed so that the legal transfer would already be registered, the documents filed, and Frank's authority as the owner would be beyond dispute. When the moment came, it wouldn't just be words or threats. It would be law. And when the law is on your side, you don't have to shout. You just have to open the door. I spent those days waiting not with dread, but with a kind of cold anticipation. For years I had been the one giving land, money, shelter, second chances. Now I was going to take something back, not out of malice, but out of justice. They had taken my kindness for weakness. They were about to learn the difference. The day of the transfer was warm, the kind of Florida afternoon where the sunlight feels heavier than it should. I had spent the morning in the kitchen, watching the clock, waiting for the moment when justice would finally arrive. At exactly 2 o'clock, the sound of tires on gravel announced Frank's arrival. When I stepped onto the porch, there he was, dressed in his formal military uniform, the medals on his chest catching the sun. Behind him, 2 police cruisers idled, their engines humming. Frank had always been a man of presence, but today he was the embodiment of authority. Martin and Melissa stood frozen on the front lawn, their faces pale as Frank walked toward them, holding a thick envelope of legal documents. The 2 officers flanked him, their expressions unreadable. Frank stopped in front of Martin, his voice calm but resolute. "You have 48 hours to vacate this property by court order. Ariel stays here for as long as she wishes. This is no longer your house. These officers are here on a civil standby to prevent a breach of the peace while you remove your belongings." Melissa scoffed, but her eyes betrayed her panic. "You can't just—" Frank didn't raise his voice, but the weight in his words silenced her. "I can, and I have the papers to prove it. This property is now under my ownership with a lifetime residency clause for Ariel. Any harassment, trespassing, or threats will be met with immediate legal action. And given your record, you might want to tread carefully." The neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the sight of the cruisers and Frank's uniform. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind in the grass. Martin's jaw tightened as he realized every eye was on him. They had no choice. Martin and Melissa began carrying their belongings to the car. Boxes, suitcases, even a large television they had insisted was theirs, despite me knowing full well it wasn't. With each trip from the house to the car, their humiliation grew. Melissa refused to meet my eyes. Martin avoided looking at anyone at all. When the last box was loaded, they climbed into the car. Before they left the curb, one officer issued a formal trespass warning. If they returned to the property or harassed me again, they could be arrested on the spot. The engine coughed to life and they drove away down the street. I exhaled, thinking maybe, just maybe, that was the last I'd see of them. They did not go far. Just days later, Linda, my neighbor down the street, told me she had seen them moving into a run-down apartment complex only 4 blocks away. They kept their heads down, avoiding the police whenever possible, because they were trying to dodge a suspended sentence from a fraud case in another state. Probation check-ins and a travel restriction kept them tethered to the city, so they holed up 4 blocks away, close enough to watch my porch lights at night. I was wrong. It all made sense. They weren't leaving the area because they couldn't. They were tied here, hiding in plain sight. And as much as I wanted to believe they were gone for good, I knew in my bones they were watching me, waiting. I didn't let on that I knew. Instead, I went about my days quietly, caring for the garden, visiting the small cafe downtown, keeping my routines steady. In the months after they were forced out, I often wondered why they hadn't simply left Miami altogether. The answer became clear. Probation had them tethered to the city, and their suspended sentence meant they had to check in with authorities regularly. They rented a cramped apartment only 4 blocks away, not because they wanted to be close to family, but because it kept me in sight. They weren't neighbors, they were vultures circling, waiting for me to let my guard down. But in the back of my mind, the thought remained, they will come back, and when they do, I'll be ready. The police cars and Frank's uniform had made for a good show that day, but the real victory wasn't in seeing them humiliated. It was in knowing I had legal protection now. They could threaten, they could lurk, but they could not take the one thing they wanted most. I kept my phone close at all times. I installed a new security system, one that sent alerts directly to the local police, and I told myself, over and over, silence isn't weakness, it's waiting for the right moment to strike. For nearly a year, nothing happened. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of them, Melissa in the corner store, Martin standing outside the pawn shop, but they never approached me. Still, there was something in their faces, a hunger that hadn't been satisfied, and deep down I knew the storm hadn't passed. It was only gathering strength. It was about 6 months after Martin and Melissa were gone when I first heard about Mark. I had known, of course, that their finances were a mess, even before I pushed them out. They had been living on my generosity for months, not because they needed to, but because it was easier than taking responsibility for their own lives. But I never imagined they could sink low enough to do what they did next. The news came from my neighbor, Linda, who has a cousin that works at the county's Department of Children and Families. Linda came over one evening, holding a casserole and looking at me with that kind of careful pity that makes your stomach knot. She said she'd overheard that Martin and Melissa had filed for bankruptcy, that they'd lost whatever little they still owned, and that, in the middle of all that, they'd taken their son, my grandson, 9 years old, and left him at a state-run orphanage. No goodbye, no explanation. They just dropped him off? I asked, my voice flat because I didn't know what else to do with the anger rising in my chest. Linda nodded, her eyes searching mine. Ariel, I'm sorry. I thought you should hear it from me before you heard it from anyone else. That night I barely slept. I kept picturing Mark as I remembered him, skinny arms, brown hair always falling into his eyes, the way he used to sit quietly at the kitchen table when they still lived here, as if afraid to speak. He had never been a loud child. Melissa called him difficult. Martin said he was too sensitive, but I had seen something else in him, watchfulness, a kind of quiet intelligence that made him seem older than his years. And now they had left him behind like he was nothing. The next morning, I called the county office. The woman who answered listened carefully as I explained who I was. There were forms to fill out, background checks, a home inspection, more red tape than I would have thought possible, but I didn't hesitate for a second. Every step I took was driven by the same thought. Mark would not spend another night thinking no one in the world wanted him. Within 3 weeks, DCF approved a kinship placement, and I was granted temporary guardianship. The adoption paperwork would follow in due course. I drove to the orphanage myself. The building was an old brick structure that smelled faintly of disinfectant and something heavier, Loneliness, maybe. The woman at the desk led me to a small room where Mark was sitting at a table with a worn paperback book. When he looked up and saw me, his face didn't change much. No smile, no frown, just a guarded sort of stillness. "Hi, Mark," I said softly. He nodded once, glancing back down at his book. "Hi." I wanted to hug him, to tell him everything was going to be different now, but I knew better than to rush. Instead, I sat across from him. "I'm here to take you home," I said. "My home. You'll have your own room, your own bed. No one will ever tell you that you don't belong there." His eyes lifted just slightly. "Why?" The question was so small, but it broke something inside me. I leaned forward. "Because you're my grandson. Because I love you. And because you deserve better than what you've been given." The drive back was quiet. He stared out the window most of the way, his hands folded in his lap. I didn't push conversation. I remembered the way my husband used to say that trust is like planting a seed. You can't force it to grow by yanking on it. At home, I showed him his room. I also filed for a simple restraining order, listing Mark and me as protected parties, and I updated the security system to notify the precinct directly. It wasn't big, but I had painted it a warm shade of blue and set up a sturdy wooden desk I'd found at a second-hand shop. On the nightstand sat a small lamp shaped like a lighthouse. "It's for when the storms come," I told him. "So you always have a light to follow." The first few weeks were cautious ones. Mark was polite but distant. He ate what I made but never asked for seconds. He did his homework but didn't bring it to me unless I asked. At night, I sometimes heard him moving in his room, pacing quietly like he couldn't settle. So I started with stories. Not lectures, not questions, stories. Over dinner, I told him about his grandfather, about the time he built the back porch with nothing but stubbornness and a borrowed saw, about how he once rescued a stray dog in the middle of a thunderstorm. I told him about when Martin was his age, how he used to race the neighbor kids to the end of the street, how he once broke his arm climbing the old oak tree because he swore he could touch the clouds. Mark listened. At first, I thought maybe he wasn't really paying attention, but then he'd surprise me. One day he asked, "Did Grandpa ever lose at anything?" Another time he said, "Dad used to climb trees. He never told me that." Little by little, the wall between us started to crumble. One Saturday, I found him in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, carefully pulling weeds like I'd shown him the week before. "Figured I'd help," he said, not looking up. Another evening, he brought me a drawing he'd made of the house. It was detailed, right down to the little bird bath in the front yard. I made sure he knew the rules of this house. Kindness first, honesty always, and never walk away from someone you care about. "Those are the rules I try to live by," I told him one night. "I want you to live by them too." He nodded, and though he didn't say much, I could see he understood. By the time summer came, he had begun to smile more. Sometimes I'd catch him humming while he worked on his model airplanes at the desk. We took evening walks together, and he'd tell me bits and pieces about school, about books he liked, about the things that scared him. I never once spoke ill of Martin or Melissa to him. I didn't need to. He already knew more than I wanted him to about the kind of people they were. My job now was not to fill him with anger, but to show him what love looked like, when it was steady, reliable, and real. And for the first time in a long while, this house, my house, felt alive again. Not because it was full of noise or crowded with people, but because the person living here with me finally understood that it was a place where he belonged. What I didn't know then was that the peace we'd built together would soon be tested in a way that would make every quiet lesson, every story, every moment of trust matter more than ever. 1 year to the week since Martin and Melissa were forced out, we were lighting 10 candles. The first birthday Mark would celebrate in a home that felt like his. Tonight we were celebrating Mark's 10th birthday, the first one he'd had here, the first one in years where he wasn't looking over his shoulder. It was a small celebration, just the two of us. The kitchen was warm with the smell of chocolate cake, the frosting smooth and shining under the light. 10 candles flickered in front of him, their flames reflecting in his eyes. He leaned forward, blew them all out in a single breath, and smiled. Really smiled. That alone was worth everything I had done in the past year. We were cutting into the cake when a sound shattered the moment. Knocking, no, pounding, at the front door. heavy, frantic, and unrelenting. I froze for half a second, then set my fork down. "Stay here," I told Mark. "Don't move from this table no matter what." He nodded, sensing the change in my tone. I walked to the door slowly, the pounding growing louder. In the pit of my stomach, I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, the porch light revealed two figures from my past. The past I'd hoped would stay buried. Martin and Melissa. They looked nothing like the people who had strutted through my home a year ago, certain they could take whatever they wanted. Martin's face was gaunt, his hair overgrown, his shirt stained and wrinkled. Melissa's eyes were bloodshot, her makeup smudged, her clothes worn thin. The scent of stale alcohol and cigarettes clung to both of them. Martin tried to force a smile. "Mom, we need to talk." I stayed in the doorway, blocking their view of the kitchen. "What do you want?" Melissa's voice was sharper, with an edge of desperation. "We've lost everything. The place we were staying kicked us out. We need a place to stay." "And money?" I shook my head. "No." Her eyes narrowed. "If you don't help us, you'll regret it." Martin's expression hardened. "This isn't a request. We're broke, Mom. And you have more than enough. You're going to help us." "I'm not," I said evenly. "Leave." For a moment, silence hung between us. Then Martin's jaw clenched, and he reached into his jacket. The metallic snap of a folding knife locking into place cut through the night. "You're going to give me the money," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Or you're going to die, right here on your porch." Melissa stepped closer, her hands twitching. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Ariel." I didn't move back, but I kept my body angled so they couldn't see past me. "You think threatening me will get you what you want? That's not how this ends." Martin took a step forward. "I'm not leaving without it." That was when I heard it, the faint creak of the kitchen floorboard behind me. Mark. But he didn't come into view. Instead, I caught the soft, deliberate beeps of numbers being dialed. "My parents are threatening to kill my grandmother," I heard him say into the phone, his voice steady. "Please send officers right away." Melissa's eyes flicked toward the sound, realization dawning too late. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. Martin's grip on the knife tightened. "You called the cops?" I allowed myself the smallest of smiles. "No." Mark did. For the first time, I saw something shift in Martin's eyes, not just anger, but a flicker of shame. His own son had chosen to protect me, the woman he'd tried to destroy. The night air split with the crunch of boots on gravel and the clipped voices of officers calling commands. Flashlights cut across the porch, throwing Martin and Melissa into stark relief. The officers didn't waste time. One moved to block Martin's path, the other closed in on Melissa. Metal cuffs snapped shut, cold and final. "Drop the knife," one barked. Martin froze for a heartbeat, then let the blade fall to the porch with a dull clatter. The officers moved in fast, cuffing him and Melissa before they could say another word. As they were led toward the cruisers, Martin twisted his head toward Mark, his voice raw. "You ungrateful brat! You've destroyed your own father and mother. You'll pay for this!" Mark stepped forward, his small frame steady in the porch light. "I'm not cold-blooded like you," he said clearly. "You just got what you deserve. You tried to destroy your own mother. You're the ungrateful one." Martin stopped speaking, the fight gone from his face. Melissa opened her mouth to plead, but no words came. The doors of the cruisers slammed shut, and the cars pulled away, leaving only the echo of sirens fading into the night. Mark came to stand beside me, his hand slipping into mine. "I understand everything they've done," he said quietly, "and I'm grateful for you. I'll study hard, and I'll repay you one day. Please believe in me." I squeezed his hand, the warm glow from the kitchen spilling out behind us. "I do, Mark. I always will." We stepped back inside, leaving the dark night outside where it belonged. And that's the truth of it. Some people will tell you family is everything, but the truth is, family is only everything if it acts like family. They called me a greedy old hag. They tried to take my home, my dignity, and even my life. But all they really did was give me a reason to fight harder for the only family I have left. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been pushed aside, I want you to remember this. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes the quiet kind is the one they never forget. This was my story. If you want to hear more true stories from this old heart, stories of betrayal, justice, and the kind of revenge that only time can deliver, make sure you subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because I still have more to tell, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.